Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the invisible, incredibly complex architecture that literally acts as the backbone of our entire modern world. It's so easy to picture global finance as just, stacks of different currencies changing hands in some bustling trading room. But the reality? Well, it's actually this fascinating, hidden grid that dictates absolutely everything, from the price of your morning coffee to the construction of massive global infrastructure.
So let's start with a really fundamental question. How does money actually cross the globe? Think about it. What springs into action when a small business in one hemisphere pays a supplier in another? Or say when an international organization funds a major infrastructure project, like a suspension bridge in a developing nation. The money doesn't just teleport, right? There is this vast mechanical infrastructure working silently behind the scenes every single second of the day.
As our source material puts it, global finance is the operational backbone of human civilization. It really isn't just about currencies changing hands. It's the fundamental infrastructure connecting all of our interdependent economies. Without this grid of institutions, the modern trade and development that we completely rely on to feed, clothe, and power the world, it would grind to an absolute halt. It is literally the plumbing that keeps human civilization flowing.
Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll look at the organs, commercial versus central banks. Then the arteries, cross-border operations. Third, the risks of international lending. And finally, we'll conclude with a look at this delicate interdependence.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the organs, specifically commercial versus central banks.
Think of our financial system like a massive global transportation network. On one side, you have your commercial banks. These are like the private vehicles on a highway. They're the active circulation system, constantly moving capital from point A to point B. But on the other side, you have central banks, which act more like the nervous system. They are the traffic authorities establishing the rules of the road, maintaining the stoplights, and, crucially, making sure the entire network doesn't crash into some catastrophic pileup.
Let's look a bit closer at those commercial banks. They don't just hold your money in some giant static vault. They act as active intermediaries. They literally take your daily deposits, which, in banking terms, are their short-term liabilities, and they transform them into long-term assets. So what does that actually mean? It means the paycheck sitting in your checking account right now is likely being used to fund a 30-year loan for a family's new home or maybe a small business's expansion. This continuous, relentless process of allocating credit is the very lifeblood that fuels our economic growth. Without these private operators, the forward movement of the economy just simply stops.
Conversely, central banks operate completely differently. They aren't out there competing for everyday customers like you and me. Instead, they strictly regulate the whole shebang. Think of institutions like the U.S. Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank as the ultimate backstop of financial stability. They basically act like a giant macroeconomic thermostat. They adjust interest rates up or down to either cool off soaring inflation or heat up sluggish economic growth, constantly trying to keep the overall economic temperature just right so everyone else can operate safely.
Moving on to Section 2, the arteries, or cross-border operations.
Now, this global network isn't just some modern invention. It's actually the result of a long, really fascinating evolution. It dates way back to the 15th century, with the Medici merchant networks pioneering early cross-border trade operations in Renaissance Italy. From there, we see these massive structural leaps. You've got the Bank of England in 1694 bringing in public debt management, and then banks like HSBC in 1865 setting up specifically to finance trade across massive geographic divides, like between Europe and Asia. But as we'll see later with the 1997 Asian financial crisis, a mature global grid also brings highly mature, systemic global risks.
Okay, so since no single commercial bank can physically maintain branches in every city, in every country, across the entire globe, that would be impossible, right? They have to rely on this truly ingenious system called correspondent banking. Think of this as a sort of global railway system for moving money. By maintaining accounts in each other's institutions, banks can move your funds indirectly across borders. They're basically handing the money off from one trusted partner to another, over and over, until it finally reaches its destination.
So how exactly do they do that? Well, it's through this elegant, centuries-old accounting handshake using some ancient Latin jargon. Nostro simply means our money in your bank, and vostro means your money in ours. These interconnected accounts are what ensure that when millions of dollars cross borders, the ledgers balance perfectly on both sides. And the best part, it happens without physical cash ever needing to be loaded onto a ship or cargo plane.
Let's walk through a real-world example to see exactly how this connects people on opposite sides of the planet. Say a retailer in South Asia purchases some heavy machinery from Germany. First, the payment is initiated by the buyer, and it's actually often routed in US dollars because the dollar acts as a highly liquid, common intermediary currency. Next, those correspondent banks we just talked about step in. They use a seamless, lightning-fast chain of verification to clear the transaction. And finally, settlement occurs. The funds are delivered. The buyer gets their machinery, the seller gets their cash, and this invisible grid does all the heavy lifting in a matter of hours or days. Pretty amazing, right?
All right, let's turn to Section 3, the risks of international lending and debt.
At its very heart, international lending is an incredibly powerful, positive tool. It bridges an absolutely crucial gap in human development. It takes wealthy nations that have extra capital, what we call surplus savings, and matches them with developing nations that desperately need that capital for productive investment. It basically allows emerging countries to borrow from a massive global pool of savings to finance their own domestic development. We're talking about lifting millions out of poverty by building roads, power plants, and schools.
As our source material highlights, it's all about turning future economic potential into present-day infrastructure. This was exactly the case back in the 19th century, when massive amounts of British capital were exported to build out the sprawling railways of the United States, India, and Argentina. That global capital mobility literally laid the iron tracks for the modern industrialized world.
But of course, with that rapid capital mobility comes immense risk. Specifically, there's this deeply dangerous dynamic known as a currency mismatch. Imagine a rapidly growing country borrows heavily in a stable foreign currency, like US dollars, to build a new shipping port. Sounds great, right? But here's the catch. That country's actual income, the taxes it collects from its citizens, is all in its local currency. So, if an economic shock hits and that local currency suddenly drops in value, the cost of buying dollars to pay back that loan instantly skyrockets. Without borrowing a single extra dollar, their debt burden practically explodes overnight, potentially bankrupting the entire government.
The 1997 Asian financial crisis is a textbook and frankly devastating example of this exact reality. What happened was rapid capital outflows from foreign investors led to sudden, steep currency collapses in places like Thailand and South Korea. Because of that currency mismatch we just talked about, their dollar-denominated debt burdens became completely unmanageable. This triggered widespread bankruptcies and massive economic contractions across multiple nations. It really demonstrates how, when mismanaged, a localized debt dependency can ripple out and shock the entire interconnected planet, ultimately leading to lost jobs and wiped out savings for everyday people.
Which brings us to our final section, Section 4, Conclusion, a delicate interdependence. So as we've seen, this invisible grid has truly transformed money from a localized tool into this massive global engine. It perfectly balances the decentralized credit creation happening across thousands of commercial banks with the strict centralized oversight of central banks. It connects wildly distant economies through trusted correspondent relationships, creating a level of interdependence that we've literally never seen before in human history. But, and this is a big but, because of this intense, fragile interdependence, the entire system relies completely on strict regulatory cooperation. If regulators fail to communicate across borders, well, money laundering thrives and systemic collapses become a very, very real threat.
Now, while we've mapped the organs and arteries of the system today, we've really only just scratched the surface of the technological side. In our next explainer, we're going to look at the specific digital messaging and settlement systems, like SWIFT, that actually pump the money through this grid with such incredible precision, moving literally trillions of dollars day in and day out.
I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder about the future of our financial anatomy. If our entire civilization relies on this delicate, invisible grid of financial trust, what happens when the technology underlying that trust fundamentally changes? As new digital frameworks emerge, how will this ancient, interconnected grid adapt? It's something to think about. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning how the world around you really works.